All right, we are on our last day of e-learning. Happy Thursday, May 28th. Those of you who have been following with me the whole time, you've been doing this since about March 18th, so a little bit over 2 months. I still miss you guys. And those of you who have not been following along from day one, do your best to try to get some of the work done. If things are not playing for you at this point, just pick other things from the list on the Flex Friday where I post that where you can catch up. Okay, so timeline of the Cold War, part 2. We're going to cover the years 1970 to 1990. If you Google, a timeline of the Cold War, you'll see a lot of different things. There's definitely many events that we have not been able to cover in this short time period. So if you want to pause the video at this moment and read over some of this, just the big stuff, then you're more than welcome to. I also just have this simple timeline where you can see the Yalta Conference. We did look at that. We learned a little bit about the Iron Curtain. 1947, the policy of containment, where the United States had this policy to try to keep communism from spreading. 50 to 53, the Korean War. Those of you who looked at that a couple days ago should have seen that nobody won, North Korea nor South Korea. It became a stalemate, and neither country, gained any land. They started at the 38th parallel and it ended at the 38th parallel. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. We looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I'm going to touch on the Vietnam War in today's Glasnost and Perestroika also, and then what happened to end the Cold War. Okay, so one thing that happens, Nixon's visit to the People's Republic of China. So our president at the time, he did visit China in February of 1972. He was the first United States president to visit communist China, with the intent of trying to talk with them and work with them, and hopefully keep communism from spreading. So there were some benefits to this visit. Trade grew between the United States and China. American tourists began to visit China, and then a Soviet leader invited President Nixon next to visit Moscow. So it opened the doors for some communication there between the United States and the Soviet Union. If we were in the classroom and we were doing our timeline, we would have done this in our interactive notebooks. Why did President Nixon visit China? To ease tensions between China and the United States as the Cold War seems to be kind of dwindling down. You had this Cold War starts, it heated up, where we had those threats of nuclear attacks on each other, wars, and then those threats start to chill out. The wars start to come to an end. So it's still going to take a long time, though, for the Cold War to definitely come to an end. I put in this political cartoon for you, the bridge that's needed. This is showing Nixon going from the United States over to China, support of the American people, showing that the United States is ready to lend some support to China at this time. Okay, the Vietnam War. So give you a little background here, what caused it. France, again, a democratic country wanting to control Vietnam after World War II, but Japan had gained control during the war. However, the communist Viet Minh took over the north. The French nor the Vietnamese wanted the country to be communist, so they fought a civil war. And if you remember, a civil war is where citizens of a country or the same area are fighting against each other. The French lose, the communist north takes over South Vietnam, and the United States becomes involved to stop the spread of communism due to our policy of containment. It is the longest war in the United States history. It lasted about 19 years. I'll show you that in a minute. More than 58,000 are killed, 300,000 wounded, 14,000 disabled, 800,000 Vietnam veterans are diagnosed as having significant to severe problems of readjustment. And just like I showed you earlier in another one about movies, several movies were created about the Vietnam War and about the effects of the soldiers coming home. So in in the classroom, we would have done this in our interactive notebook. What made the Vietnam War so difficult? The land was so harsh, it made American soldiers struggle to survive. What was the Tet Offensive? It was a lot of attacks from North Vietnam onto South Vietnam. How did the U.S. finally end the war? As you see, it was a 19-year war. January 27th, 1973, President Nixon signs the Paris Peace Accords, pulling the U.S. out. A lot of people basically feel like we lost this war, and there was a lot of disagreement, complaining, disgruntlement in our country because of even being in that war. Okay, Glasnost and perestroika. We're going to look at this. So this means openness or publicity, and the U.S. Soviet leader at the time, Gorbachev, he started this policy of openness so he could kind of show what the reasons were behind decisions he was making. So he was, publicizing his decisions and being open about what was going on in the country. Although he was free to do that, he did not advocate complete freedom of speech from the people. So as he was being open about what he was doing, he really didn't want to hear any complaints or anything back to him. But this Glasnost is this idea of being open with the citizens about government decisions. Mikhail Gorbachev, movements towards progress, reform, openness in the USSR in the 1980s. That's your Glasnost. Perestroika was him restructuring the economy. So they're under a command economy at this point, and he is trying to restructure that some to help his people thrive a little bit more. What are the effects of this new economy? Well, it effectively starts to lend to the end of the Cold War. They stop the weapons race because they're not putting their money towards their military constantly and weaponry. And it leads to the outlawing of nuclear war, except in terms of defense. If we were in the classroom, this is what we would have in our interactive notebook. What were Glasnost and perestroika? They were Gorbachev's new programs of openness and reconstructing the economy. We would have drawn a picture. You would have picked either Glasnost or perestroika. I picked Glasnost, and I drew USSR shaking hands with the United States, saying, we'll be more open about what we're doing in our government decisions. So you will know more about what's going on in our country. And this was in the 1980s. Okay, the next event that we want to look at, the significant, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you learned that the Berlin Wall was built to protect East Berlin, so this had been around since 1961. In June of 1987, in a speech at the Brandenburg Gate commemorating the 750th anniversary of Berlin, President Ronald Reagan of the United States at that time challenged Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, to tear down the Berlin Wall. It's time that we stop separating these people. So about 3 years later, June 13th, 1990, the East Germans officially started dismantling the wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the first step to reunification of Germany, which was finished on October 3rd of 1990. The dismantling continued until November 1991, so it took a long time to take down the wall. Only a few sections and towers were left standing as memorials. We would have drawn a picture of the Berlin Wall being torn down. You could have drawn it however you want. This was mine. So these are supposed to be people standing behind on the east side. These are lots of people. If you Google this, you will see people standing on top. This is supposed to be the west side, where it had the paintings and the graffiti. Okay. All right, and then finally we have the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Union. Why did it collapse? So a lot of the people started to resist the Soviet Union. They wanted their own, their political rights. They wanted individual rights. The change in his economic system was ineffective. Standard of living has just continued to decline. as the citizens of these communist areas looked to Western countries and they saw how, freedoms of citizens usually created a more, a better quality of life. So they start to fight against what's going on in their lives. August 24th, 1991, Gorbachev resigns. Republics immediately start to declare independence. If we go back to this slide right before this is, all of communist area at the time. So lots of these republics in this area really start to declare their independence immediately. Gorbachev resigns as general secretary of the Communist Party, and within a month, all of the Soviet republics that have been united as the USSR, except Russia, declare their independence. So this is what our interactive notebook might have looked like: the collapse of the Soviet Union, what prompted it. Some Soviet states rebelled against the new programs. They kidnapped Gorbachev and tried to take over the government. This coup failed, but Gorbachev did end up resigning. Who became the new leader? Boris Yeltsin was the first president of Russia, the country of Russia. And here's where this country of Russia that you're more familiar with becomes at this time period, December 26, 1991. Okay, so let me go back one. Hold on before this. All right, so let's see, some effects, obviously, that I haven't covered is with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union being a superpower is no longer, and the United States emerges as the world's superpower. We take on a larger role in the United Nations, the World Bank, and other global organizations. This is where we start to see a lot of technological advances. There's lots of nuclear weapons being stored in countries. A lot of wars start in these small areas, like in Yugoslavia, which used to be an area when I was growing up, Czechoslovakia, things like that. So capitalism starts to spread in these previous communist areas. So those are some more effects of the results of the ending of the Cold War. So your turn. I want everybody to answer 1 and 2, just like you did on Tuesday. And then you can choose to answer 3 or 4. Some of you are answering both, and that is fine. But just make sure everybody answers 1 and 2. So number 1, how effective was the United States policy of containment during the Cold War years? Don't just tell me it was effective. You need to provide evidence from the past 3 to 5 days of learning in your answer. Number 2, in your understanding, if you had to tell me what the Cold War was, what would you say? So everybody answers the red, 1 and 2, and then your choices. Number 3, describe how you would have felt watching the Berlin Wall being torn down if you had lived in communist Berlin. So if you've been on the eastern side, the plain wall side, how would you have felt watching the Berlin Wall being torn down? Or choose number 4, why do you think historians say that the Cold War was just a continuation of World War II? So choose one of those. Okay, I look forward to your answers. And then remember, you have until June 4th to update or try to catch up on any missed work. So until the end of the day on that day. And I will be making sure that I'm grading everything that you have sent on June 5th. All right. I look forward to seeing your answers.